on today's episode, we have an amazing guest today, Joshua from Roon. Joshua and I started collaborating in, I think, March of 2023, which is kind of crazy that it's just like a year and a half ago. It feels like way longer than a year and a half, but super excited to share how the optimized experience has been for Joshua. So, hi, Joshua. Super excited to have you on. And if you want to jump in by giving a little bit of an intro on yourself, Roon, and what you do within Roon.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Um, so I'm a cardiologist by training originally. I'm at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and I'm also the Chief Medical Platform Officer at Roon. For me, I was a brief story, I guess, leading into it is I was a cardiology fellow in training, and my sister got really ill. I had been thinking a lot about the kinds of questions that most cardiologists think about, like trials and how do we make our drug therapies better? How do we diagnose people better? And when my sister got really sick, I started thinking a lot more about what happens to people when they're really ill. What happens to them when they're alone at home trying to figure these things out, Googling their health conditions. My sister had a pretty rare disease, and for me, it was the same thing. I was on Google trying to figure it out. And I met a great group of like minded individuals, all kind of thinking about this same issue. And you think about, what technology has done for us and all the amazing things it's done. You think of home shopping, you think of Amazon, you think of home entertainment, you think Netflix, and then you think about healthcare information online, which is 7 to 8% of Google's daily search volume, billions and billions of questions. And what do we have? We have, WebMD, MayoClinic.org. These websites are still among the top 15 most visited websites in the world. Or, for God forbid, like Instagram and TikTok, which we know is rife with medical misinformation and conspiracy theories. And so we set out to build something better that gives people answers to their health questions, no matter what they are, no matter where they are in the world. And that's really where Roon was born and what we set out to build.
That's awesome. So, did you start with some of like the specific? I know you started with specific answers to specific diseases. How did you decide like what diseases to go for initially? Was it because of your background in cardiology, or was it like the most pressing issues?
Yeah. And so just a bit more background is so Roon is a Q&A service. So every disease we do, we build this database of questions, anything you can imagine. What is this disease? How is it diagnosed? And we started out with this idea that it should be, in the very beginning, really hard diseases, things that are very difficult to navigate. As
Mm.
we asked people to, download this new app or go onto this new website, like there had to be some real motivation. We had to be doing something much better than what's out there. And so we started in places where we had deep personal connections. So my sister had a disease called ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. So we did ALS. One of our people on our founding team's father was suffering from dementia. We did dementia. One of the other doctors on the team, uh, chief medical officer, he's a neurosurgeon and glioblastoma specialist. So we did in quick succession like ALS, glioblastoma, and dementia. And then we started to think about like where is there a dearth of healthcare information online? Like where is there a shortage of specialties? And so we also did for everything fertility and family building. And that includes things like
Mm.
IVF, egg freezing, and infertility, even things like surrogacy.
So, you mentioned a database in that. So, if you're talking with Optimize, you're obviously using Airtable because that's all we help build in. So, how did you come across Airtable? How did you decide that it was going to be like the point solution for some of the things you're doing at Rune? And then also, how did you end up finding me?
So I think one of the members of our founding team actually knew one of the investors in Airtable. And so we had a very rudimentary Airtable to start. And it was, I think, even in the earliest days, it was like Google Sheets
Yeah.
that we started with. And we're like, there's got to be something better than creating these Google Sheets for every single disease and every single condition that we're doing when it's also interrelated. And so we got turned on to Airtable, and and then I think when I met you, our Airtable system was already beginning to run into problems with things that we had come up with, and we knew we needed to create something even better and more complex. To give you an idea of the scope, each disease that we do, we're writing, somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 questions. Each question had designed it so it could have child multiple answers from different experts. We wanted to be able to provide an array of perspectives, and so already there, like, things were starting to get a little bit interesting. Like, what's the best way to design this, like, parent-child relationship of questions to answers, and all the kinds of data we wanted to tag on every question. We wanted to provide a really guided experience, so you can get the question that you need and the answer that you need. And so, how do we hard code in all those relationships into a database? Was really when we started thinking, like, maybe we need some help. And I
Yeah.
think I remember, I was sort of tasked with up leveling the Airtable database, and I just started watching YouTube videos, and, like, all these different things, like what is a linked field, what is a roll up field.
Hmm.
Roll up one puzzled me for a while, um, and I think that's where I came across one of your YouTube videos.
Yeah, and now you're like kind of like the de facto Airtable guy at Roon. Like you're like the one
I
with the most knowledge now.
Yeah, but I am the Airtable person at Roon. There are many other members on the team who've also become really good at using Airtable, but I have a love affair with Airtable now. And I would say the other amazing thing about our working relationship with you is you've been really kind and generous, and we treat most of our sessions as not just like help us fix this, but um, you know, teach us how to fish, so to
Yeah.
speak. And so I am watching you actively as you work, and we talk through things. And we needed your help very intensively in the beginning, and I still run into things all the time I can't do, but we can check in like once every other month when we run into some big database problem that we can't quite solve on our own. So it was a very intensive period initially, and then sort of it's more of like a maintenance phase now, where we come to you when there's some automation I can't figure out, when there's some complicated database updating system that I can't quite figure out how to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of the early things that I remember, like as far as what we would kind of train on the calls, were related to just fundamentals of database design. Because you came from cardiology, you didn't come from like studying relational databases or access databases or anything like that. So I remember that I feel like that was a lot of what we talked about was like one to many relationships versus many to many or one to one, and how to like build around this.
Oh yeah. I mean, that was it. I mean, it was very simple database design. I remember it was like, we have questions, answers, and sessions in which we ask our experts questions. And even just like that simple idea was like, you know, beyond us initially. And you helped us design that from the kind of ground up.
Yeah. So now I think a lot of the database design has been more or less figured out. And now we've been able to move on to some cooler things like reporting or more advanced roll up fields and stuff like that. Because once we figured out I think we probably set in stone the database around maybe 2 months after we started working together.
Mhm.
Everything else is just kind of expanding on top of that.
Yeah, expanding. I mean, the database structure is there. And then, we may end up talking about like process management within the database is another
Hmm.
big component that we kind of established first. And those principles around like how do you manage a process, we've then gone on to apply to many other things. How do you track dates as things move through a process in Airtable? Was like another really fundamental learning early on. And now it's like, now our database has like 25,000 lines of data in some of the tables. And now it's like, oh gosh, like we have this like big like automation that we're trying to figure out. I can't wrap my head around. And then that's when we reach out to you.
Yeah. Do you remember what some of the first use cases or the first challenges that we worked on together were? And I think it was around what I would call like programming, but do you remember what some of those first ones were?
Yeah, so every week, I would say that, and that's just where interfaces have also become really useful. So our entire team looks to Airtable to try and understand like what experts are we working with that week, and what questions are we going to ask them, and what answers are they going to produce. Um, and so interfaces, designing interfaces with you. Now, I still remember very early on, I was like, what is an interface and how are we going to use it? And because we were all just working directly in the data initially when we built
Yeah.
Airtable initially. And I've really tried to move our team. Like, there are only a few people who should be actually touching the data. Anyone else on our team, anyone else we work with, should be touching the data through an interface. And that has been like a breakthrough moment in our like um, and so the process, the programming thing is like all of our team looks to this like schedule of what experts we're looking to every week, and so we together built this interface that like lays out that schedule, and all these other features around it and around programming. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure when we first started working together, using a lot of views on the data layer, what we were doing is like if you had a new session, you'd have to create a view for each session versus then the interface, it just more or less like automatically creates that filtered view so that you can
Hmm.
just easily click through and hope, I think that probably saved the team a lot of like headache and time.
Oh
So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, now I really try and keep as few people as possible to actually building new views. To me, like, are useful in certain cases
mm,
and can quickly like balloon into this like absurd list of everyone's creating their own views. It's all collaborative views, not personal views, and it becomes a giant mess. So I've really tried to push the team away from using views and much more to like interface based interactions with the data.
yeah, yeah. So to jump to the what you had brought up just a second ago, the I think what I call it is the story of the status field. So a status field is just like pretty simple field in Airtable. It's one of like the most simple things in it, but it often tells like a story behind it. And I think the story that we talked about just before we jumped on was on the answers table. Could you talk a little bit about what that status field is, and then
Yeah.
get into a little bit of what the story
So
is?
yeah, in the simplest format, we have experts who are recording questions and answers in one, like usually these like sessions where we work with them to like, you know, bring their knowledge to the public. And then we have these individual bite-sized answers that we're delivering to people through the app. And so we had a whole process management system that we needed to develop that like takes that information that's from the expert's brain and moves it along in a stepwise process all the way to the end. And we needed to track data around that process. Like, we edit it, we add transcripts, we check it for errors. And so every kind of step along the way there, we needed to create a process and a way and single select status field. I mean, I think you had this light bulb moment. I remember when we were talking about it, you're like, oh, this is just a single select status. As you're like moving through, you showed me all the ways like, oh, we can also, every time the status changes, we can clip a date to that. And
Mhm.
I use that automation now all the time. You, again, teaching me a man how to fish. Now I know how to build that automation to tag dates on things using the date modified field. Um, and so that was like also a revolution for us.
Yeah, so I think I also have some YouTube videos around that, but basically that date is you can then track how many days does it stay in a certain status or what's the day from the first status to like the fifth status, like till it from when it's recorded in one example to when the editing is done, maybe eventually to when it's published. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is a little bit around the different users that are actually using the system. So Roon has an app. So we're not necessarily talking about all the users of the app because that's really the end user, like the customer of Roon. The people that are internal at Room are the people who are editing and doing some of the planning of sessions. Could you talk a little bit about getting the buy-in of people on your team to get to use these internal tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think Airtable's been here since almost the beginning of the company, and everyone has been bought in on using it, particularly for what we call our FAQ, the question answer database. I would say the big push has been getting user adoption around like moving people away from the data. So I like
Hmm.
try and really get people to like not use the actual database itself, but to creating all the different types of interfaces we use. I have like I think like probably 20 or 30 different interfaces we use for different parts of the process. So one of the challenges has been how do I design an interface that works for this use case, a thing we need to do at the company. You actually helped me recently build an interface that was specifically about like content updates, like things we need to like Q&A that we need to keep updated over time. And that can sometimes become complicated. We have an entire interface system for the people who are reviewing or editing the videos. And actually, like, it was very easy adoption there. Like, you helped me create a beautiful interface, and we have actually, I'll tell you, gotten amazing feedback from the editors that they think this is like the best system they've ever interacted with for like a process management around like editing and reviewing videos. Very simple, very easy. We just tell them like, here is your interface. I can limit external users to only that interface. This is your thing. 2-minute walkthrough. This is how you do it. No problem at all. And then within our company, the only challenge has really been, you come up with your in your brain there is like this thing I want people to do within the company on a regular
Mhm.
basis. And I have at times run into challenges um, designing those specific interfaces that really encompass the full vision of what I want it to do. And that has been probably the biggest challenge to give the employees at the company the exact tool that they need and to get them then to use that tool. That has really been the bigger challenge. When the tool is like easy in Airtable and it fits the exact use case of what we need to do within our company, I'd say the adoption is easy. But when it doesn't, it's like doesn't quite fit exactly. That's when the adoption has been difficult.
Yeah. And actually, real quick, one of the things I think is so cool about you is you came from this world of cardiology which I think is like so different than Airtable, and now you're like learning all of these like software development concepts, which I just think is admirable. But
Thank you.
one of the software development concepts with this is user stories. And so like when we're starting a new project, building things in Airtable, we'll try to capture what we call user stories. And that's basically like talking with users and hearing, okay, an editor needs to go in and see their queue of all their sessions they need to edit, and they need to get these clips from it. As like a simple example, that's like a
Mhm.
story of what a user needs to do. So I feel like that's just like one concept that's come up for us as we're doing it, is like often I'll be just talking with you, but you've been pretty good about saying, okay, either let's pull this person in the room to talk about this, or you can try to like put yourself in their shoes and say, this is the story of the editor, or this is the story of like how this other person, how you think they need to use the
Yeah,
tool.
and compliment back at you. Actually, you are incredibly fast when we log on. Often we have these like 1 hour sessions, and we'll start out the first 10 minutes, and it's just like, here is the story of what we're trying to do. And then you kind of have this like quiet, pensive way of thinking through things and taking things in. And then and then usually like the last, like once we get through that, you ask a bunch of questions, and then 40 minutes like you've designed the entire um, interface or whatever it is we're trying to do, which is always really impressive. I think occasionally you've needed to take like 10 minutes afterwards to kind of like put some polish on it,
Yeah.
but in most cases we've gotten our entire user story like solution within that hour.
Yeah. And I think like capturing the user story at the beginning of building anything makes like everything else so much easier. If you only capture like, if you like told me you want a project management tool, you could have told me that at the beginning of working together, that you like your team needed a project management tool to know what are editors doing, what are these people in my team doing. And if I could have just built you something, like I could have replicated Asana or Trello, but then like what you needed was like a database to manage these specific processes. You didn't need like a projects and tasks. So I think asking like the right questions so that I'm not making any assumptions, like that is like my way of kind of foolproofing myself out of building the wrong thing is how I would
Yeah.
say
Yeah,
say that.
that's your love language.
Exactly. Exactly. um it sounds like most everybody, like the leadership at Rune, they already had kind of buy-in on using it. Was any of the leadership at Rune like really tied to the data layer, and how did you get them to use the interfaces instead?
Um, yeah, I would say like, the one thing I'll mention, which is our company is still sometimes divided between, we use Notion for some things
Mm,
and Google Docs for other things. And there's been some tension in the company. Like I'm like, oh, can't we just do everything in Airtable? And there is some tension there. Like there's parts of the company that organizationally live in other places, and that's been a tension. Like, is Airtable really the best solution for everything we want to do in terms of like mapping and tracking projects, right? Is it really the best solution? There are some features, I don't know if we want to dive in here, about like Notion and like Google Docs that like fit a little bit better. Mainly this idea of like folders and documents within folders and concepted together. And I
yeah.
still get some. I think people sometimes, I'm like a broken drum. I'm like, can't we just move all this to Airtable? And there's still some like adoption resistance to that. That our brains, our like digital brains, might need other tools other than Airtable. But we've talked about some of those things, like what could we bring over to Airtable? What can we not? Um, and then your question was like, what have been the specific use cases where I struggled to bring people over from like the database over to interfaces?
Yeah, I think that's like a common struggle that we hear from different people if we're trying to build the like an interface first workflow, but there's people who have previously like had the flexibility that the data layer gives them. A lot
Hmm.
of times they feel like restricted when they go in the interface. They're like, I can't, they maybe want to create their own view, or they want to, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit harder to like fluidly bring in and out different fields into the things. Like it's a lot easier in the data layer to kind of like quickly hide and or add or filter or like change views in your field, like the appearance of it. What's the height of the rows? Like what's this?
Hmm.
Like I'm doing this specific task. I want to make the rows of the heights better. I want to move this column over here, this column over here, and so that is probably the only instance where it's like where you're kind of futzing with the data, exploring something, looking at whatever aspect of the database. It's just like a little bit more cumbersome. Like you have to go edit the interface in certain
Yeah.
instances. A lot of people don't even know how to do that, which is sometimes good, right? Like they
Yeah.
don't know how to edit and change the interface to look the way that they want it for that specific instance, that piece of data that they're trying to look up, um, or that relationship across the data that they're trying to understand. And in that case, that's where I think the interfaces fall short.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. When did you happen to know when you started using Airtable at Rune? Like what
Oh,
year ish?
oh gosh. If it's 2024 now, 2023, it was like probably end of 2022.
Okay. So, but when you first started, then you at least weren't using interfaces. And if I think back a
No.
few years, like let's say 5 years ago, Airtable did not have interfaces or automations, which is a lot of what we've built with you. If you look towards the future, either the use cases that you're putting into Airtable, or maybe that in a few years you may not be putting into Airtable, or just what would you say are your predictions for where you see the systems at Rune being in a few years?
There's a couple things I envision that I would my kind of like wish list. Uh, Three things. One is the home screen, like has got to get more well organized and like easier to use. I think the home screen is like I foresee it becoming much more easier, and I wonder if there's a way to integrate there, like what we do use from Notion, which is like folders and documents for certain types
Mm,
of things, to be able to like really map your entire brain, external brain, of what you need to know at the company, in like a way that's not just like a long text field. Um,
yeah.
um, Is there a way to more seamlessly do that? The other things that I think were, and I think I just saw a product release about something about this, but I'm already starting to envision problems as our database really gets much larger. We have visions that in the next 18 months, we may get to like 200,000 lines of data. And I run into issues where, as our database gets big, it's already starting to run slowly in certain instances because it's constantly being loaded. The data is constantly being loaded. So there are ways to interact with Airtable where you can maintain like a server or something where when you need and much larger
Yep.
databases. Options to like have a server where you can directly access the data for very large databases. I think I saw a product release actually recently that is somehow related to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that was
Um,
last Thursday, I think. I think it was last Thursday they released, I think it's called HyperDB, which should,
mhm.
in theory, allow millions of records. I haven't actually played around with it yet, but it is significantly expanding the record limits. So fingers crossed that it still maintains the speed that you guys need for like moving things through your pipeline.
Yeah. And it's also really exciting to see where AI goes and how their AI solutions can better fit like our day-to-day needs. I've started playing around with some of it. Can it automatically categorize things into the appropriate buckets? Can it, their text-based summaries or text generation options, like how good can those get to solve our use cases? Those are some of the areas, but they got to make the home screen better. Come on.
Yeah, yeah. The search, like a lot of times, will get shared on just one base, and I feel like it's impossible sometimes to find the one base for us.
Mhm,
Even like go to the home screen, it shows you all the workspaces in one view, or you star things. I just have to deal with starring things really
mhm.
intentionally for the things that
Yeah.
I use most. After this, I'm gonna that hopefully nobody on the recording cares. This may be out by the time people are watching, but there's a new Airtable AI feature that is as of October 4th, not released yet, but I'll show you after this. After
Oh,
I
cool.
can't show it on the recording, but
Yeah.
it's pretty exciting. And you got reached out to by Airtable to give feedback on their AI, which was pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. And it was super fun to have you on here. Would love to do another one of these in a few years once the database is at a couple 100,000 records and we've built more stuff in Airtable.